we have the privilege to have with us Thomas Estermann, that Raffaele will introduce in a minute, and he has many things to share with us. Please, I see that everybody is muted. Just remember to keep your microphone muted throughout the entire duration of the webinar. But as you know, we are very happy to interact with you throughout the chat box. Feel free to leave us questions, as we will get back to those towards the end of the webinar during the Q&A part at the end. And I think at some point you will also receive some links connected to activities by Thomas Estermann and his team. So please keep an eye also at the chat box. Thank you very much. And now back to Raffaele.
Thank you very much, Giulia, and welcome everyone. It's always a pleasure to be with you in our series of in conversation with, in this case, Thomas Estermann and the geography of higher education. Now, it is very important for us to have this discussion with Thomas because we have been very innovative in these conversations with experts. We have touched upon several issues, sometimes we have seen some advanced discussion, advanced practices, but today is really about reality. So it's about the mechanisms, the incentives, and the governance arrangements that you need to implement, make things actionable, and advance the agenda of the entrepreneurial higher education institution that is connected with the ecosystem and generates innovation for the actors. Now we have the pleasure of having Thomas Estermann from the European Association, or the European University Association. Thomas is the Director of Governance, Funding and Public Policy Development at the European University Association, which represents more than 800 universities and rectors' conferences. The European University Association gives voice to these institutions and promotes best practices and mutual learning within its networks. So, Thomas, thanks again for being with us. I jump immediately into the first question and to give you the possibility to explain to us. So we know that governance plays an important role connecting higher education institutions with their ecosystems. Now, we would like to discuss with you what are the current situation, what is the current situation, and what are the common challenges that you can see from your observatory into different systems. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raffaele, and thank you very much, Giulia. It's really a great pleasure to join you for these sessions. I think they are very good format, and so I'm very happy to contribute with some elements from the work that we've been doing at the European University Association. As Giulia already mentioned, a colleague of mine will also feed a little bit the chat with some further links or further details to this work, because obviously here I can only touch on certain elements. Now, on governance of higher education institutions and universities, I think this is really a key success factor for a successful engagement within the university ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem, but more generally broader with engagement of all stakeholders. And it forms part of, I would say, 5 key factors that are important. So it's the system governance. I think it's very important to clarify as well to differentiate between system and institutional governance. So system governance would be all the frames that sort of shape the institutional processes and governance. Then of course institutional governance, equally important, are the sort of funding and funding incentive frameworks. Those are, I would say, that the third one. Then leadership and development as a fourth part of the whole governance equation. And the fifth one would be the alignment of strategy and the implementation. And I would say that the governance arrangements are at the core of an appropriate and successful engagement. Now, why is this such a challenge? And I think Raffaele already mentioned it in the introduction. So this is something as a challenging reality, because as an institution, as university, have to balance the priorities of the different missions. So from learning and teaching to research and innovation to engagement with society and other actors. And obviously, they also need to find the right balance of inclusion of the community within the university and the different stakeholders. And that is quite a challenging endeavor. And from the work that we've been doing from our university scorecard, where we analyze 30 higher education systems also on different aspects, but governance is a very important aspect, we can see that there are hugely diverse arrangements across Europe, how the governance is set up. So this can range from you have different governing bodies that are relevant for decision-making processes. You have systems where there's only one governing body that is responsible for all the decision-making processes. But the majority across Europe has a sort of dual structure where you have two types of governing bodies. One would be typically called a Senate, where you have the academic community represented, or the institutional other different actors, and largely responsible for academic decision-making processes. Then you would have a second body that can be called a board or a council, and that is usually the body that would be then responsible for the more long-term strategic decisions, the strategy, the funding. And in this body, you also have typically a mix of different people, internal or external, in some cases completely external as well. So just to give you three examples from three systems where this looks very different, we have, if I take Spain, for example, there you have two main governing bodies that I just described, but they are actually quite large. So you have the one, the academic body can have up to 300 people involved. So clearly this is very inclusive on the one hand, but of course a very large governing body. Equally, the council can have up to 50 people, also largely represented people from within the institutions. You also have some people coming from what they will call a social council, which is a third body that includes a lot of stakeholders from the society, from the region, from business and industry, and they also have up to 3 people in this governing body. So you can see there's a high inclusion on the one hand, but also a very large governing bodies. If I take as a third example, Austria, where you have equally 2 bodies. One is a Senate, and then you have a board, which is composed completely of external stakeholders. And what's interesting here as well, you have a form of how do these people come into the governing bodies. So you have half of them are decided by the university and half of them are sent by the government. So you have a mix of also who decides who's coming into this governing body. And if I take a third example with England, where you also have a dual structure, but there it's also a mix of external people in the governing body, but there they're exclusively decided by the university who they are. And they typically have a sort of search committee that define the profiles of the people who are in there. So this is to give you a little overview of the huge diversity that's existing across Europe. And of course, the key success factor I would say in the engagement process comes also of having the right profiles and the right people in the governing bodies that help also with engaging with the different communities in different sectors. So the innovation ecosystems, obviously what you want is a right mix that fits also the profile of your institution. What are your goals and what are your aims? So this is the frame where you can actually shape quite a lot how successfully you can engage in theory and in practice. So I'll leave you this here, maybe for responding to your first question.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So now, during the second question, let's continue this conversation on governance, and in particularly about the formal and also informal mechanisms affecting engagement and knowledge exchange, depending on how we want to call it, between higher education institutions and their ecosystems. And also the type of, let's say, trends and what has changed according to your observations during the last few months during the pandemic. I know that you're active in different surveys and research on these different topics. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, I think that's indeed what you could see from what I described in the first part, that this huge diversity across Europe obviously is important to look at how this is then set up in reality and how things are implemented. So you have the formal structures, but you have a lot of how universities can shape this. Obviously, in some systems, you have a greater degree of freedom. So the example of England, where you can say, okay, if they get it right, it's the institution who is responsible for getting right. In some other systems, where are other actors responsible for the setting, the scene, for sending people, you have a shared responsibility of getting it right. Now, but this is obviously just one element. But how can you, one of the success factors that we have seen, and that has changed a lot in this last decade, is a much better reflection on what kind of people you need in the governing body that can help support the strategic direction of the institutions. So obviously they're very important actors to drive the strategy, to drive a much greater profiling of what the institution wants. And they're also, secondly, very important to make the link to the different actors of the different ecosystems, to make the links with business and industry, with the region, with societal actors. So the important part is to get the right mix of people in there. Now, once you have the right mix, it's equally important to engage them, because there we've seen as well very different settings. You have people in these governing bodies that can be very active, can contribute a lot to the advancement and engagement of the universities, and you have others where this is not the case. So there is a key point of how you can engage them. First of all, if you have people coming from outside the sector, it's important to induce them to the university environment, because clearly if you have, I don't know, a CEO from a private company who's used to a very different environment and structure, he can of course provide very good input in driving the strategy, in driving the connections, but he also needs to be aware of how decision-making processes work in universities in link to academic freedom, institutional autonomy. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is also how do you connect them within the institution outside of, let's say, these formal processes. So how can you have them also as champions that connect the institution in the different activities. So this is really something where we've seen that some institutions doing this very well, of where they have great input from these people in these governing bodies, making the connections and also ensuring that what is then the role in driving the strategy is also implemented. Obviously, it's important that they also have the support, the institutional support structures that they are there and following up. So, for example, if you have someone who's making good connections with the regional economic and innovation fabric, you also need the people within the institutions who can follow up. So that ranges from legal people that make the partnerships agreements, but also to make the connections through the institution to the researchers, to the academic community. How do you connect the learning and teaching mission with the research and innovation missions also for these aspects? This of course sounds evident, but is in reality quite a challenging complex, and shows that you need to have a very good setup of how, and I call this aligning the strategic priorities with the implementation, so that if you have someone that is in your governing body that can open doors, that can make connections, that has contributed to strategy, that this is then also followed up and implemented. So that is a very important key factor in that respect. Maybe I should also mention that the institutional leadership also plays a core role in making this governance working, because they have to take then the strategy into the reality and be also the leaders that things are also implemented. And we've also doing quite a lot of work on this, on showing what are the sorts of roles and capacities that institutional leaders need in order to manage and lead also the governance of the institutions. We're about to start a project. It's called New Lead that will look into that. But we've also have already done some work on within it's called the Ustream project, that looks at the leadership role in transforming, in making, in adapting also the governance structures in an informal way to be more agile, to be more open and engaging with the different actors. The other aspect that
there's a problem with the connection.
You say, okay, now partnerships.
Thomas, we lost you for 30 seconds, let's say.
Okay. Am I back up in?
Yeah, the other aspects is?
Well, I talked about a little bit about the leadership, and what I wanted to start talking about now is also the engagement during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what's the impact on engaging in partnerships? Because clearly the transformation towards a much more virtual reality, there have been, let's say, fears at the beginning that this would also impact the engagement with the different actors. We have to differentiate a little bit here. So what we get as feedback from many members is that for those who have active partnerships, they work very well also in this virtual environment, or the much more restricted possibilities that many systems have to face now. So that works quite well. There have been even, let's say, expansions of partnerships with the role of universities in helping to fight the pandemic on various fronts, obviously on finding vaccines, but also much broader in terms of engaging in health system and support. So that has actually provided also possibilities to reach out to new partners, or I would say renew engagement, particularly also with governments, with policymakers, about the important role of universities in the missions of learning and teaching, research and innovation. So that's one aspect. Clearly, for some institutions that do not have such a strong profile or strong setting within their communities, it's much more difficult to engage in new partnerships, reaching out to new horizons in engaging in that respect. And of course, also on an international setting, if you look at it more globally, this is more difficult for smaller institutions to engage in this, because obviously within the exchange of the academic world, this was also a very great opportunity of meeting and getting new connections done. So that is obviously more difficult. So to conclude with this aspect, I would say you have, on the one hand, the trends go clearly towards a much more efficient and dynamic governance structure in general. Secondly, it is always very difficult to find the right balance between efficiency, inclusions, and being able to connect with your economic fabric and the ecosystem fabric around your institution. But I would say that also what we've seen in the past 10 years, there's a much greater engagement of these external members that maybe, I would say 10 years ago in some systems have sometimes been seen as a necessity that the framework has described that this has to take place, where now there are much more reflections about how can we engage them in the institutions, that they become these ambassadors, these champions for engaging outside. So, and I think the pandemic has not stopped this trend, although there are obviously some challenges that everyone has to face with, but I would say that we're certainly on a route that's going to continue with an even greater awareness in more and more systems and more institutions, that this is something that this is just not a formal frame, but this is if you get it right, a huge enabler in the engagement agenda.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This is interesting, because we have seen also that there are pull and push factors operating on universities. There is a part of the COVID that is a catalyzer of everything, but there is the sustainability agenda, the inclusion agenda. There were the visionary leaders. Then there will come probably the Fridays for future students that will cause new revolutions inside the governance of the university. But if you had the magic wand in the last 5 minutes that we have, what would be the governance innovation that at this point you would operate to make higher education institutions able to play an active role in the post-pandemic world? So in the resilience and recovery facility situation of the next generation EU, what is that you would do?
Yeah, if I pick up the sort of what you referred to in your last part, the next generation EU, it's a huge funding package that's going to be delivered at European level, and indeed that plays a lot. That I think that's one of the elements that shows that certain funding incentives can drive a sort of a policy agenda. And in that respect, a couple of words on Next Generation EU, that is a funding package of 750 billion euros, so almost 2/3 of the 7 seventh year multi-annual financial framework delivered at European level.